Hi all, welcome back. Let's now turn to the topic of WUG testing, which in fact we've already encountered in several guises, in several forms already. For instance, just above, when we talked about some of these fake words like cryotic and mork. In fact, we were discussing a sort of WUG testing. And we've seen several weeks ago the concept of WUG testing be applied in connection with the process of nasal assimilation in Japanese verbs. So if you recall, we saw nasal assimilation in Japanese verbs be applied before this past tense suffix da. And so for instance, if native speakers of Japanese are presented with a invented past tense form, kinda, and we ask them whether the present tense form is kinu or kimu, it turns out that in principle, both forms are possible because either a coronal nasal or a labial nasal would have to surface as a coronal nasal in this context preceding a coronal stop. So we had seen an anecdote there which looked at a sort of informal WUG test with a couple of native speakers of Japanese, where they agreed that yes, it could be possible for the stem of this verb to be either kin or kin, given the past tense form kinda. And as I've said, just above here, looking at the instances of velar softening here, those reflect a sort of WUG testing, examples made to test the productivity of phonological rules. So what is really a WUG test? Well, a WUG test was first invented by Jean Berko-Gleason and first published about in a paper in the late 1950s when she was looking at testing the productivity of English inflectional morphology. She was seeing if first with young children and then also with adults, if they would indeed be able to productively use rules of inflectional morphology, like forming the plural or the past tense, with invented words. And in doing so, Berko also demonstrated the productivity of processes like epenthesis and obstruent devoicing, because, of course, for generating the different allomorphs of both the plural suffix za and the productive past tense forming suffix of English da, obstruent devoicing and something like vowel epenthesis play a role here. Let's have a look at a video with some original footage from Berko-Gleason's experiment.
This is a lung. Now there's another one. There are two of them.
To illustrate that what the child has learned is a grammar and not a huge memory bank of phrases, Jean Gleason invented a test called the WUG test. This test shows how children can apply the rules of their language, even to nonsense words that they could never have heard before.
Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two WUGs. Right. Oh, look at this funny one. This is a man who knows how to bod. He's bodding. He did the same thing yesterday. What did he do yesterday? Yesterday he bodded. Bodded, right. This is a gutch. Now there's another one. There are two of them. There are two gutches. Right. This is a Bick who owns a hat. Whose hat is it? It is the Bick's. Now there are two Bicks. They both own hats. Whose hats are they? They are the Bick's. Right.
Yeah, great. So that's quite nice. We saw the productive application of several different morphological rules and corresponding phonological processes. For instance, there was I think a WUG stem, something like bob, and in building the past tense form, Berko-Gleason in that video asked the child, who was about 5.5 years old, I think, to produce the past tense form. And in this context, the child produced the form bodded, something like that. So I would have to listen more carefully to exactly what vowel. I would assume it's something like the I front central vowel. It could have been a bit lower, more like a schwa, but that's not so important. The important thing here is that in this context between the two coronal stops, there is epenthesis produced in generating the past tense forms. So the basic idea here, and you actually saw in the sort of in the video this cute looking bird image, which was called a wug, and there we saw that a wug, when combined with the plural suffix z, is realized as wugs. So in the context after a voiced consonant, the underlying form of that plural building suffix of English surfaces faithfully. So the basic idea is simply to test the willingness of speakers to use morphological and phonological processes by presenting them with words that they could never have encountered before, and seeing what forms they will produce or will accept. This can also be done as a judgment task in which you present speakers with different options and ask them to rate which forms they like better. Now, one interesting point in Burko's experiment, I think that most of the speakers agreed completely on the forms, but for a few forms, there's some variation. So in particular, there's one thing which was called, used a wug term, a heath. And in producing the plural of this noun heath among native English speakers, the native English speakers were not quite sure what the plural should be. So approximately half of them produced the plural heaves, changing this th to a z, this th to a voiced v, and using the suffix z. But about another half of the participants in the experiment used the plural form heaths with a voiceless f and a voiceless s, productively applying obstruent devoicing. Below, we'll talk a little bit more about the basis for this uncertainty in this particular case. One other interesting wug test, which is worth reading about, besides Burko's experiment, was an experiment conducted by Adam Albright and Bruce Hayes concerning the formation of English past tense forms. You can find the paper on Bruce Hayes' website. So, as I've mentioned, most new verbs of English build their past tense forms with a suffix that has the underlying form da. However, in English, there is a considerable number of so-called irregular past tense forms that are built through vowel changes or ablaut, or the lack of some suffix. And the origins of these irregular verbs are diverse. Some are inherited from Proto-Germanic and are equivalent to strong verbs in German that exhibit ablaut, though there are some that result from later phonological changes in English. And one common theory concerning the formation of past tense forms in English was that only the suffix da was productive, and that all of the irregular forms were memorized and accessed by memory. That is, speakers have no rules for generating irregular forms of English, like ran as the past tense of run, or kept as the past tense of keep, for instance. And the question that Albright and Hayes pursued here was really whether there are phonological contexts in which speakers sometimes prefer novel irregular forms. So they usually presented the speakers with possible regular forms and possible irregular forms and asked them to rate the well-formedness, the goodness of those options on scales. And it turns out there are indeed some phonological contexts in which speakers find an irregular pattern, the productive application of an irregular pattern, to sound better than the corresponding application of the regular suffix. So this shows that there is some psychological reality to even these irregular processes, which are certainly less productive than the usual rule, but they are still able to be used occasionally. And with respect to the formation of past tenses in English, there's also historical evidence in this regard that sometimes new irregular past tense forms are created by the productive extension of an upload process or some other process, and not just the irregular past tense forming process. And we'll talk about one such alternation a little more below. All right, let's pause again here before we look exactly at how we can try to formally account for and deal with, so to say, processes that are not perfectly productive.